Hello, my name's David Runciman, and this is Past, Present, Future. Today's bad idea is one with a long history. It's the idea of the end of history. I'm going to be talking to the historian Ayse Zarakol about what was wrong with that idea when Francis Fukuyama first expounded it at the end of the Cold War, and what's still wrong with it today. Ayse, we're going to talk today about an idea that I think has two very different kinds of meaning. So there's a very specific reference point for the idea of the end of history, and then there's a much more general sense of how you might use it. And we're going to talk about both, but the specific refers to a particular place and a particular writer, Francis Fukuyama, place in time, 1989. He published an article in a magazine called The National Interest in the summer of 1989, so crucially before the Berlin Wall came down, so it seemed very prophetic, in which he talked about history having come to an end. And by that, I think he meant that the big historical questions that had animated the 20th century in particular, the big ideological confrontations, had been resolved in favor of liberal democracy. So liberal democracy was the answer. And he then wrote a book in 1992 elaborating on that thesis. And it's probably fair to say that in most people's minds, this hasn't aged particularly well. The idea that at the end of the 1980s, the beginning of the 1990s, history revealed the answer to the big question, and the answer was liberal democracy. So we'll talk about that and Fukuyama. But there's also a sense in which the phrase the end of history speaks to a kind of mindset or an attitude to history, which is that it might have an end or it might have a direction of travel. There might be a shape or an arc to it so that we can know where we are along the way of the story. And that's not just Fukuyama. It's not just the Cold War. I think probably that mindset crops up in lots of different places, but it speaks to a way of thinking about how the world works. And I also want to talk about that. And then let's see what the relationship is between the two. But let's start with Fukuyama for a bit of context. So I don't know. I remember it. I was a student, but I'm guessing you maybe are too young. Do you remember the vogue of that phrase at the time, the late 80s, early 90s? When did you first come across it?
I think I came across it when I went to the US for university. So that was at the end of 90s. So about maybe like a decade after. I remember introduction to global politics class was set up Fukuyama, Huntington, The Clash of Civilizations. And then there was a third article by, I don't know if you remember, Robert Kaplan, The Coming Anarchy. And I think that's where I first got the introduction.
And was the implication that you were meant to choose one of these three? So either it's the end of history, or it's the Clash of Civilizations, or it's the coming anarchy. Was that the setup?
I think, yes, that was the setup. These are three visions for, what's next. Yeah, and I think at the end of the 90s, it was still, the end of history, I think, was still ahead. And then, of course, 9/11 happened. And then, Clash of Civilizations became the framework, at least Americans used to see the world. And maybe now it's more coming anarchy, although most people probably don't remember that third Atlantic article, but that was in the mix, yeah.
The end of history was ahead at the end of the 90s. And I was thinking about what were the staging posts on the unraveling of this idea. 9/11 was certainly one. I think the financial crisis was another. So by the time you get to 2007, 2008, the ways in which some of the, as it came to seem, complacent assumptions about the end of history era. So one of the things that was associated with the end of history era was what came to be called in the States, at least, the great moderation, the idea that liberal democracy hadn't just answered the big philosophical or ideological questions, but it was working in a way now which meant some of the lurches of fortune and some of the sort of whiplash quality to 20th century politics had been ironed out. And then the financial crisis hit. And suddenly it looked like liberal democracy had been living a kind of illusion or a kind of dream during the end of history era. And then there was the Brexit Trump year, 2016. That was another one, the invasion of Ukraine. I mean, there are lots of points where people might say the illusion of the end of history was exploded. Is there one of those that speaks to you in particular?
I never thought personally that it was the end of history. But in terms of the general consensus, like that feeling, the war on terror and I think the financial crisis, it really started undermining this idea, I think, globally, that the West Because I reread Fukuyama's writings in preparation for this podcast, and he opens with this idea. It's the triumph of the West, the Western idea. That's what he says. I mean, he walks it back later, like in his subsequent revisits. If we take end of history as, the triumph of the Western idea beyond liberal democracy, free markets, what really started undermining this notion that the West represented the end of history, I think, are those things together. The war on terror and, US's betrayal, I think, of its own principles with regards to international law, human rights. I mean, you could say that's been there, but people had forgotten about the various hypocrisies, I think, in the end of history period. And then it started coming back. And then the global financial crisis, which was really a Western financial crisis. Yeah, I think that's where I would date the story.
Fukuyama spent quite a lot of time since then, and he still writes about it. He still tries to justify the original position, not just stepping a bit back from the original premise, but saying that people misunderstood it. They overinterpreted it. They thought he was claiming more than he was. So he was very clear. If you read even the original article, he says very clearly, I don't mean that big historical events have come to an end. Big stuff is going to happen. There are going to be wars. There are going to be conflicts. What has come to an end, I think he thought, was that modernity had been a contest between big, globalizing, universal ideas about how to organize society. These were Western ideas on the whole. And there had been a real contest between them through the 19th century and particularly the 20th century. And these ideological contests had been resolved in favor of one of these ideas. And nothing was going to come along and rival it. The gist was the reason history has come to an end is it's impossible at this point to imagine. They said at some point in the future, who knows? But at this point, it's impossible to imagine a serious competitive rival in the space of ideas or ideology to liberal democracy. There are a couple of things you could say about that, one of which is, and maybe we can talk about this, whether there is a rival. But the second is that view of history is itself a very contingent modern Western view, that history was being played out at the level of these universalizing Western in origin conceptions, communism, democracy, fascism, and others, ideas of how to organize a society. And that's what history is. History is that kind of competition. And that also now seems quite a quaint idea, that somehow history should be identified with the contest of ideas and ideologies in the way that would have been true in the Cold War era, but isn't true now.
Yeah, actually, he has an article in History and Theory in 1994 where he revisits the end of history argument. And he's in this, second section of that essay, he equates, universal history with economic modernization. In fact, he says not much changed until early modernity. And then history is the history of economic modernization. And that causes these competitions between, I'm paraphrasing, these ideologies, and liberal democracy is the best one given those conditions. It's not perfect. It doesn't meet all the needs humans have, but compared to the alternatives, it's the best one. Yeah, I mean, it's a very interesting notion of history. First, the idea that there is no historical change before modernity. And then the idea that the 20th century contests are the only alternatives we can come up with when it comes to seeing the meaning of human life. I'm trying to be fair to him because, rereading stuff, it's not terrible, but it's just a very different way from how I think about things.
So what is the thing that you think he fundamentally gets wrong? I agree that I also want to be fair to him. And the book, The End of History, which he published in 1992, it's still a really interesting book. It's quite a surprising book because it's quite bleak. In some ways, it's quite a pessimistic book. He's associated with a sort of optimistic triumphalism around, liberal democracy is won and it's all going to be fine. And he says, liberal democracy is won and it's not going to be fine, because the trouble with liberal democracy is actually it kind of hollows us out a bit. It's a bit boring. It trivializes a lot of these big questions. So the great thing about the big contests over how we should organize societies is at least there was a lot at stake. I mean, it was terrible. The wars were terrible. The costs that were borne by the societies that were on the losing side of those struggles was terrible, but at least everyone got a sense that this really mattered. And the trouble with liberal democracy, he says, writing in 1992, and some of the examples he gives are things like the European Union, which he thinks this is a model for the future. And it's kind of dull, it's bureaucratic, it's procedural. It will end up trivializing politics and we're going to feel emptier. So it's not like he's a euphoric celebrator of liberal democracy. But he just doesn't think that anything can come along with a universal claim to this is how you should organize a society, which can compete with it anymore. So do you think anything has come along with a rival claim? I mean, if you look at the world now, is there anything with an equivalent rival claim? Or, as I suspect, do you think that the premise is wrong, which is that the only way to think about history in the broadest sense is as that kind of competition? So maybe what's come along is not a rival universal claim, but actually the fragmentation of all universal claims. And that's what history is.
The competition between universal claims, as you say, that was like a 20th century moment. I mean, what's interesting to me is that existed before. I mean, I think of history more as, I guess, repeating itself. So I think there are moments where universal claims compete, and then there are moments of, fragmentation and disorder. So the ideologies and the worldviews match the underlying conditions. So nothing has come along yet to rival the ideologies of the 20th century, because we're in a moment of fragmentation and disorder. But that doesn't mean that nothing will come again. I'm pretty sure that something will come again, actually. I've been drawing these parallels between the 21st century and the 17th century, this period of general crisis and fragmentation. We can talk more about that. But what's interesting for the purpose of this discussion is, like, in the 16th century, a lot of people thought the world was ending, which was like another end of history moment. There was a lot of millenarian thinking. There was competition between claims to universal empire, and a lot of the emperors, like the Ottoman Sultan, they were claiming to be rulers at the end of time. And I think, that kind of competition for universal claims and standing at the end of time is seductive, because it makes you a very important agent of history. It gives meaning to your life. I mean, that's also like the recognition stuff that Fukuyama talks about. And then when the competition is over, that's a bit sad. You have nostalgia, which Fukuyama also recognizes. And then there's fragmentation, periods where there is no universal competition or claims or the equivalent of 20th century ideologies, because people need to make sense of, what's happening here and now. But then once the right conditions are reforged, when the world becomes reconnected, then there are more universal competition. I mean, that's kind of how I think of it. So I think he gets part of the story right. I think his mistake is to think. It's always a mistake to think you're at the end of history, or what's happening has never happened before and will never be repeated. I mean, that's the hubris bit, I think. But perhaps the reading of the 20th century, it's not wrong as far as that goes.
So he's right in the sense that this may be an end of history, but only because history has ended many, many times before. And of course, that means he's wrong. It's also true that when he tries to flesh out why liberal democracy has won, he says it can meet two basic human needs in a way that no rival system can match. And those two needs are a need for material progress, I mean, a need to be better off in various material ways. And he thinks the history of the 20th century has shown that liberal democracies are quite good at meeting people's expectations to lead materially better lives, but also the need for recognition that it gives human beings a sense of personal dignity, that they mean something as individuals. So you could have an ideology that is all about material progress, but the individual is collapsed into the crowd or the mass or whatever it is. And that hasn't aged particularly well, in the sense that it does seem like there may not be rival ideologies, but in a fragmenting world, the different kinds of nationalism that are out there. I mean, if you think of what is the Chinese political system offering as a rival to liberal democracy, it is not, I think, a universalizing ideology anymore. But that version of nationalism is about material progress, for sure. It's about lifting people out of poverty. It's about improving people's lives on all of the measures of material progress, life expectancy, poverty, literacy, all of that. But at the same time, it is about respect, not necessarily at the individual level, but for the individual as part of the nation. And it seems, for the reasons that you said, in a world in which liberal democracy looks pretty hypocritical, its respect is only respect for certain people and not respect for other people. It looks quite powerful. It's not like everyone else has given up on trying to give people material progress, and at the same time recognizing that human beings crave personal meaning and to feel that their lives count for something. What's gone is trying to frame it as a modern universalizing ideological project of how to organize the whole of human society. I mean, that seems to me the thing that, yes, there isn't a rival at that level, but there are lots of rivals at the more immediate level of how individual societies are organized.
I think this is a problem we haven't solved yet. That's why, I think the larger claim that liberal democracy is, well, the modest claim it's the best available solution to these problems. Okay, maybe that's true, the best one we've come up with, but it still doesn't solve the problem of recognition, because the recognition that you get in a liberal democracy or the liberal international order, it's kind of a very thin, kind of empty recognition. And in fact, one could say what really sustains it, or has sustained it for much of the 20th century, is feeling superior to other people around the world that did not live in liberal democracies or participate in this order. So it was kind of simulated, recognition hierarchy, not real recognition, but still feeling I'm at least better than others. So how to make that universal? Could you have the same satisfaction if everybody is equally recognized? I think that's kind of an open question. I mean, even like in Fukuyama, rereading The End of History, he has this phrase which I highlighted. For our purposes, it matters very little what strange thoughts occur to people in Albania or Burkina Faso, for we are interested in what could in some sense call the common ideological heritage of mankind. I mean, he's so dismissive of people in Albania and Burkina. He's saying it's not possible that they could ever come up with anything. And it's like, is that liberalism? I mean, is that like liberal recognition? I don't. There's so many contradictions like that in liberal thinking. It's not supposed to be essentializing, but it essentializes, the West. I mean, it's so hard to avoid those traps. So I don't think liberalism has necessarily solved the problem of recognition in different ways than other belief systems or nationalism or religion. It's has always partially piggybacked on this feelings of superiority to the other, which is illiberal, but it has always benefited from that. So we have not yet come up with an ideology who's managed to universalize recognition without doing that, I think.
And is the reason that it feels so thin precisely that it's the one that still has these universal claims? I'm curious, when you first came across it, so you went to study in the States, you grew up in Turkey. So when you came across this way of, you've got to choose, you've got to decide which horse you're going to ride here, the end of history, Clash of Civilizations, the coming anarchy. But the end of history one, it has these universalizing claims, but did it strike you as very American or very Western? When you read that argument, when you first come across it, did you think, well, this is just the kind of thing that someone who grew up in a particular tradition, and we should say Fukuyama was a kind of State Department policy wonk. I mean, it's quite bizarre that he became, for a brief time, the most famous public intellectual in the world just because of a phrase. And he probably was a little, as well as being thrilled and rich, as a result of it, a little embarrassed by the scope of the claims that were then being made in his name and on his behalf. But did it strike you as a very American idea?
I guess so. Yeah, I mean, I was intrigued by it. This is also, around the time of getting introduced to Hegelian dialectics and so on in political theory classes. And so I remember reading Huntington and getting enraged, by the characterizations of parts of the world that I was familiar with. I don't remember being angry about the end of history thesis. It was alien to me. Yeah, I guess it was American, because one of the things I was most struck by when I first went to the US is how nobody knew anything about history, nor cared to know. It's a very ahistorical place, or pretends to be. And Fukuyama makes this argument the world is going to be divided into two parts. He says historical and post-historical. It was very foreign, this idea that you can escape history. But I think that is a very American idea. It's you see it also in American social sciences, international relations, which is my field. In UK, in many parts of the world, it's quite historical, but Americans study it quite ahistorically. Same thing with politics, with numbers, and I think it has to do with this again. Going back to what I was saying before, like there is a connection, I think, between how you view history and how you view your agency. And I think Americans like to think that they can escape the forces of history, or that they have escaped.
It's certainly true that Fukuyama himself, I don't think Hegel was particularly part of the briefing notes of State Department officials in the late 1980s, but to do with the way he had been educated at American colleges, he sort of stumbled across Hegel, and it came to him as a kind of revelation that there is a way of thinking about history which does give you an escape clause. It gives you a kind of out, which is there is a resolution moment. And that did then chime with what happened in the world. It felt like America had been living a very historical existence since the Second World War. It had big obligations. It was fighting a long war, the Cold War. It had to try, although not particularly successfully, to educate itself about what was going on in other parts of the world. It wished that those other parts of the world were more like America than they turned out to be. But then when you get to the end of the 1980s, it is almost like finally we can step out of that. The Cold War is almost a nightmare that you want to step out of. It's a nightmare of being ensnared in history. And now here is our escape. I mean, I don't know now whether it's an American mindset, but it may itself be a fairly brief period in American history that people really believed there was an escape. I mean, there's always been in American history a strand of politics which wants to escape by just turning inward, but that's different. There's the turning inward escape. That's always there in American politics, and it's there now. But this is the universal escape. This is like there's a universal story we can tell, and that gets us out of history. And that feels like it didn't last more than about 15 years. I mean, it didn't last much more than the 1990s.
Yeah, maybe it's kind of a recurring moment. But there's, I think, in the US, there is that desire to escape from history, or thinking that history doesn't matter. Because again, if you think history doesn't matter, then you have higher estimation of what you're capable in this moment of achieving. But if you grow up in Turkey like me, or a place where like the historical narratives matter a lot in identity construction, then every problem has like, such a weight and such a past. It's just like different ways of seeing the world. They both have their flaws. But I mean, ironically, it's to say that, US or the West is post-historical. I mean, what I've been seeing in recent years, decades, is so many of the debates in the US, for instance, with the re-election of Trump, some of the reactions. I mean, it's like things I've seen before in Turkey. So it's like they are, they are the ones actually now behind or in history. It's like it's come almost full circle. The supposedly post-historical is now in the past of places like Turkey.
So I want to ask you about that and how many different ways there are talking about what history is or what it might mean outside of this Western construct. But I think the other thing to say about it, about the end of history mindset, as you said at the beginning, it's not just Western, it's very modern. And it's partly modern because it has a view of history, that history is a kind of science. It's that Western view that history is the study of the past in order to solve or resolve puzzles, and to get a sense of the ways in which where we are now is an answer to things that in the past were mysteries or irresolvable questions. What the historian does is studies the past partly to get a sense of how we are beyond that, and the past becomes a resource for our ability to solve problems. So history is a kind of problem-solving mechanism, and that's part of Fukuyama's argument, I think, that we are at the end of history because we have reached a moment of ultimate problem solution. And as you described history there from another perspective, Turkish, non-Western, whatever you want to call it, Albanian, Burkina Faso, and you use words like it's a weight, it's like a burden, it's a tradition, it's the thing that you're grappling with. History is not the academic discipline that is close to the sciences as a problem-solving device. History is it's like the heavy, humid air that you breathe. It's a completely different image. It's not the modern Western image of history. I mean, of course, not all Western historians have thought like that, but there is a kind of hubris in 18th, 19th, and 20th century historical perspectives from the West that somehow our ability to look into the past, to study the past, to understand the past in our terms is a tool that we can use to advance the cause of modernity. That's not what you were describing at all.
Yeah, I mean, you could look at it as, Western, non-Western, but I actually think that view of history has to do with power and where, where you're situated at a given moment in history. So I referred before to, 16th century universal claims and so on. This idea of seeing yourself at the center or the end of history, that's a practice that predates, Western history writing. It was common practice, in the early modern period or before for non-Western rulers to have world histories produced, not in the scientific way that we have, but it would end with that person. This person is the culmination of all these great leaders now comes to this person. So I think that tendency, if history is favoring you at a moment, there is a great temptation to write yourself to the end or the pinnacle or the center of it, or to see what has come before as leading to you. And then maybe seeing patterns or, of course, the Western approach, the scientific approach to history has taken that to its logical conclusion, which, as you say, we, study history to see patterns that can help us think about the present. And then if history is not favoring you, then it becomes kind of an explanation or maybe a justification. It's not your fault that things are great at the moment, but your ancestors, the mistakes that they made, these problems predate you. Then that's a different way of seeing. So I think it's more than Western, non-Western. I think it's powerful and powerless, and the way that they relate to what has come before as a result of where they are situated at the moment.
Don't Drink the Milk is back for season 2. And we've got even more surprising stories that take us through time and around the world. Coming up this season, sex.
Drugs.
And lawns? We're back on the road to bring you the hidden histories of sex, drugs, and so much more. Hit subscribe wherever you get your podcast fix.
But then in that 16th century version of it, as you said, so you have the powerful, the great men commissioning histories of the world, which end, the final chapter is them. And that's one version of how history ends. But it coexisted then with that millenarial sense that the end of history was apocalyptic, transformative, revolutionary. It would turn the world upside down, which is often the end of history view of the powerless, that those without power see the end of history not as a culmination story, but as a kind of explosion, that this world that we live in will be transformed into something else. Now, there's none of that in Fukuyama. I don't think it's hard to think of a less millenarial. Fukuyama's is all about we've reached the end of something. And what's so depressing, as he says in his book, about what comes next, is it's just more of the same. Whereas millenarial views of the end of history, the eschatological view, which is that history reaches a point at which something happens which makes everything that's gone before kind of irrelevant because now we're in a new world. And that, there are modern versions of that, which is revolutionary politics, eschatological revolutionary politics. But that's the end of history version of the powerless, isn't it?
Well, powerless in between, I think. It's like they were powerful for their time. That fight at the end of times still matters for people who are engaged in it. It's often some kind of fight between good and evil, and if you take your positions, the world ends, and then the cycle repeats. Many pre-modern cultures have versions of this, so it still makes your life valuable because you're engaged in this end times fight. But maybe it's a bit more humble in terms of what man can achieve. There are forces beyond man, and everybody has their role to play in this grand narrative. So what differentiates Fukuyama and I guess the modern man is the idea that there's nothing beyond us, and that history, everything was our doing, our agency. We've solved problems to the extent that they're solvable, and history ends. And then the history restarts not because it's cyclical or there's structural forces beyond our control or climate change or something. I mean, Fukuyama says if history restarts, it's because we're bored. I mean, it's like a very human-centric view of history. It's not because things will go wrong that we cannot control. We will just restart it, because, we don't have anything better to do. That's the original, I think, the 1989 position, which he moderates a little bit later.
So do you think that we would be better off thinking about history as cyclical? So I'm enough of a kind of modern person to associate cyclical views of history with the thing that modernity left behind. And maybe this is a mistake. I don't think I fully imbibed a kind of modern view that it's all progressive and teleological and heading somewhere. But I tend to think of a cyclical view of history, the sort of rise and fall and rise again and fall again. And we've been here before view as a pre-modern view. And that's how most human societies tended to think, not all by any means, but tended to think about historical change, that you should never get carried away and somehow think you'd move beyond what is actually an endless turning of the wheel. So when you look at people hyperventilating about Trump and think, yeah, but I lived this story 20 plus years ago, or if you come from another part of the world, there's nothing so remarkable about the predicament you, the United States, find yourself in. If you knew more about history, if you knew more about other places than America, you would know that you are actually repeating patterns rather than somehow stumbling on something manic and new. Do you think we should be willing to say that this is cyclical?
Yeah, cyclical. I mean, cyclical, is it the same thing as repeating pattern? So recurring patterns, but there's a cumulative effect as well. So I guess maybe dialectical, cyclical and cumulative, but not in the way that, it doesn't end, I think. Or maybe it ends for the people at that time, but then as long as, humans are still around, some of these patterns will repeat themselves. So I think, as I was saying before, we create orders, they fall apart, then we recreate them. And then I think within those, there may be certain dynamics that are recognizable or patterned. I mean, I wouldn't be so formulaic as to say it's always the same, like the rise and fall of civilizations and so on. I don't think that's true. At the same time, human beings are not that different. We're not that different from our ancestors. So the political solutions we come up with and the problems we create, there are often commonalities between them from a certain level of abstraction.
Is the real problem with the Fukuyama version just that it's so parochial in the sense that, as you said, he sort of thinks the story starts in about 1688 and it finishes in about 1988 roughly. It's like a 300-year story. So there wasn't history before that. I don't know what he thinks was before that. What came before that was just stuff repeating itself. And then suddenly something happened where we moved on to a different path, and we were on a path which clearly had a direction of travel. Before then, there wasn't a direction of travel, but now there was a direction of travel, and it reached an endpoint. But if you think that history goes back before 1688 or 1789 or whatever you think it is, there's so much more going on. And suddenly what happens in those 300 years looks a little parochial. It looks a little like it's just one small part of the universe. And there's a world out there which is full of other ways of living.
Some of which are similar and some of which are different. Yeah, he does say, I can't remember which essay, but he says nothing changed in China for millennia. I mean, of course, that was the belief. If you don't know about something, people thought that about ancient Egypt. Nothing changed over 2000. So from enough distance, things look just more of the same to us. I mean, I think Western civilization would maybe look the same to people who didn't know. So, I mean, without necessarily denying the idea that modernity has sped up the pace of progress and change, it's not true that there was no change in history before capitalism or economic modernization.
So if Fukuyama then said to you, so what did change in China before modernity? What would you say? Or in ancient Egypt? What is the history that he's missing? Is what changed simply that forms of power rose and fell? Or is it more than that?
Well, forms of power, but also ways of seeing the world. I mean, the claim that he makes about, liberal democracy and free markets, these satisfy most human needs. I mean, you could say that about other belief systems that existed. You could have said that about religion. Nobody foresaw that the decline of religion, that, when it really mattered, it met many of the needs of human, recognition, dignity, making something of the lowliest person. So, you could generalize that to China or Egypt. There have been different beliefs and ontologies and worldviews that satisfied people as long as they did, and then they didn't. And that's a recurring pattern in human history. That's not specific to modernity.
The other thing that is key to that version of the end of history, as you said, is that human beings make their own destiny. And one of the things that it seems to miss is the ways in which human beings are at the mercy of forces that they can't control. But also, since Fukuyama wrote The End of History, the other thing that most people, not all people, but most people are aware of, is that human beings are also at the mercy of forces that they themselves created and now can't control. So it's not simply, as might have been the case in a pre-modern version of this, that we are at the mercy of natural forces that are beyond the ability of human beings to regulate. In a pre-modern version of this, the harvest fails or whatever it is, and you are aware that there is a deep contingency to your attempts to manage your affairs. What seems to be different about the 21st century version of this is that most of us have that sense of contingency, but it's as a result of the things that human beings did during the modern period. It's like the age in which history came to an end produced the forces which mean that history has not come to an end, because we do have things in common with people in the 16th century, or going back much further than that we're living on a planet that we are deeply uncertain about whether it's going to be able to look after us or we're going to be able to thrive in it. We've created technological and other forces that feel like they have a life of their own. And so there's a kind of ironic version of this, which is that the thing that Fukuyama said ended history, which was modernity solving the basic problem of human recognition and material satisfaction, more or less at the moment he said it in 1989, we became aware that we were on the cusp of climate change, and not long afterwards, the digital revolution, as a result of which we feel increasingly powerless. So the period in which history ended was only about a week. It's like there was a point where Fukuyama believed this at almost exactly the moment that the thing that he thought had ended history was restarting history.
That's exactly right. I mean, and that's why I like this 21st century, 17th century comparison. Some historians now think 17th century also had, part of the turmoil, political turmoil in the 17th century had to do with climate change. In that case, cooling, that was the peak period of Little Ice Age. And then you have warming up, coming up to Industrial Revolution, and then warmer. So in some ways, the 20th century is kind of an aberrant period where the climate is as nice as it has been and as stable, and we have like high degree of agency, and the two things coupled together create this hubris about what we can do. We're going to the moon, we have these very capable state structures. We really contribute to our current predicament by the choices that we made. But it is remarkable. I mean, rereading this material now, it's just how absent our current concerns about technology or climate change, or it's just not there. So in that sense, the historical text is interesting. I think it was there in Coming Anarchy. I think that was the one that talked about environmental degradation and crowding of African cities and so on. But it was still not climate change. It was more about what the rest of the world is doing. So I guess in the 90s, we didn't think about this at all. And the universe had the sense of irony, this moment on the edge of the precipice, patting ourselves on the back.
Don't you think the 90s feel more and more like a really anomalous decade? So maybe not for you, in the sense that, so as you said, the 90s was the period where you moved from one country to another, and the kind of education you were getting became a North American college, eventually grad school, IR education, whatever that means. But you had seen a different world and a different way of thinking about the world. But to live inside, as I did, inside the 1990s from inside the liberal democratic bubble, the 1990s just do look now like such, even compared to the 80s or the noughties, whatever we call them, the 2000s, never mind compared to 50 years earlier and 50 years hence. The 1990s is such an unusual decade, and yet so much of our politics and our way of talking about the world is still sort of anchored there.
It is, and I think it creates this nostalgia. I mean, even people who are around now and people making decisions, the older generation, the Bidens and so on, but also like our generation. I mean, I have some memories of, the Iron Curtain and like the difficulty of travel, but the world that I grew up in, you could basically travel anywhere in the world and have friends from anywhere in the world. When I went to the US to study, many of my friends were from Eastern Europe. So it's become very difficult, like mentally, to adjust to how the world has changed in the opposite direction. Even though I grew up in Turkey and I have a degree of cynicism and pessimism and so on, I feel like when it comes to the rest of the world, it's like it must be temporary. I mean, even though I tell people in the West, you have to prepare yourself. Things are not going to get better and so on. A part of me assumes, all the difficulty of travel and all these walls going up and so on, that's just not natural. Because I think when I was young and coming to know the world, the world was my oyster. Even with, visa issues and passport problems, still, in theory, you could go anywhere. And I think that makes a difference when you grow up and how you understand the world, because you see that as the natural way the world should be. And then everything else that happens after that is kind of measured against it. And the 1990s was quite aberrant in that sense. But many of us take it to be the norm, and something we've lost that we should go back to. But maybe it's actually not achievable.
In some ways, your journey, though, is the opposite of the one that most people have taken, in that you said, because you came from Turkey, you were pessimistic and cynical, and then you experienced the 1990s, and now in the back of your mind, you have an underlying optimism because you're sort of harking back to the thought that it was like that then and it'll be like that again. I think most people have gone the other way in that they were pretty optimistic then, and now there's an awful lot of pessimism. I mean, this is definitely not an optimistic age, I don't think. And insofar as there is optimism, it's a sort of reactionary optimism, which is currently dominant in a lot of electoral politics. There is a more positive story coming from those people who are offering a kind of reactionary politics. It's like, we can make this better again, we can do this better. There is a much better story to be told about America or wherever. But the people who are nostalgic for the 1990s are, on the whole, pessimistic. I mean, Fukuyama's pretty pessimistic, actually, if you read stuff that not completely, but if you read stuff that he has to say now. Most people don't have what you just described, which is a sort of thought that this is the temporary phase and the thing that we remember from when we were younger is going to go back to being the default. I think most people have a sense that they are terrified that that thing has been lost.
Yeah, I think people do see 1990s as lost, but I'm not sure I completely agree. I mean, yes, there is a lot of doom and gloom in the West and so many workshops and meetings about crisis, the end of the liberal international order, but there is this underlying optimism that something like the 20th century will be recovered. I mean, even like, I think Cold War 2.0 or like, the three worlds, global West, global East, that sort of, these scenarios that come out of my discipline, I think they are optimistic in the sense that there is a belief that something like the Western past can be recreated in the 21st century. The lack of imagination of different scenarios, or like the nostalgia for the 20th, yeah, I mean, that's something like an optimism, I think, like under the pessimism. Even the worst case scenarios that people posit for the 21st century in the West, they are kind of familiar scenarios. So that's what I mean, like that optimism of having grown up in the 20th century, people making decisions think something like the 20th century, whatever period of it, can come back. But maybe the 21st century will be very different.
Do you think it's an illusion? Because if you have a more cyclical or dialectical or whatever word you want to use for it, view of history, and as you said, you take the long view and you see that orders rise and fall, answers to the fundamental questions of how human beings can flourish in the world hold, and then suddenly they don't. And there is order and there is disorder. But it doesn't tend to resolve itself over the course of a human lifetime. And even though it has all speeded up, no question, it's got quicker. Nonetheless, the expectation that somehow this thing can resolve itself into the next kind of order might happen, say, in your and my lifetimes, that would seem pretty optimistic, wishful to anyone who had lived through a previous age of disorder. I mean, disorder tends to also hold for as long as it does, and then it doesn't. But it's not as though it answers to the need of each generation to re-establish its own order with which it can live. If this is the new age of disorder, comparable, say, to the 17th century or comparable to a period in Chinese history where one established way of organizing a society fell apart and it took a while for another to be created, It's not going to happen in our lifetimes or our children's lifetimes.
Well, that is certainly possible. And I think so much of the discussion now, as pessimistic as it is, doesn't consider that scenario. It's always like, oh, yeah, yes, things are terrible, but soon there will be some kind of, things start making sense again. We will know who the enemies are, what the rules are. But yeah, actually, it could be no rules, no certainty. I mean, especially with the pace of technological change, add to that climate change, the volatility of late stage capitalism, as they like all of these things, just the underlying structures of the 20th century order are not there anymore. It's like we're on quicksand and we're trying to recreate the order that we had, which seems to me very unlikely that it can be. Like the 90s or the 80s or the 70s could be recreated given these larger conditions.
I want to ask you about one other use of the phrase "the end of history," which is by Yuval Noah Harari. So people will know him probably as the author of Sapiens, but in the book that he wrote after Sapiens called Homo Deus, which is about the thing that he has become, I think, obsessed with, which is the coming AI transformation of the human experience. He talks there about the end of history. Now, he takes a really long view of history. So he doesn't think history is modernity. He doesn't think history is, since human beings settled in cities. He doesn't even think history starts with agriculture. He thinks history is the story of Homo sapiens, because history is the story of that period which began when human beings evolved to the point that they could use language to tell stories about themselves, which gave them a sense that they could imagine worlds different from the one they lived in, and then try and create those worlds. And starting, for want of a better word, at the most primitive level, 100,000 years ago, all the way through to now. And he thinks that's what's coming to an end. So what's coming to an end is the story of Homo sapiens, because the technology revolution has meant we've reached a point where human beings, if not now, are imminently going to lose their ability to recreate the world through their imaginations, because it won't be their imaginations. That this is now being franchised out to machines, to technologies, which will treat us the way that we treated the data points in the past that we used to build these new imaginary worlds. And so, yes, we are at the end of history, not because something happened which has a 300-year time span, but something is happening now that has a 100,000-year time span, which is the end of human agency, essentially. Human agency is going to be replaced by a different kind of agency, which is not in a way that we would recognize human. Now, if that is true, that is the end of history, right?
Yeah, one end of history. Yes.
If it's true. I doubt it's true yet, but if it's true, there is no history without human agency. Or is there?
Well, I mean, you could say humans didn't have much agency, in the beginning of when Harari is like the earlier periods they're writing about, and they think, they live with, I don't know, wood spirits and all these gods and so on, like that have much more like agency, and they're subject to whims of all these capricious beings that coexist with people before monotheism and so on.
But I think he would say at least they were their wood spirits. These were their phantoms. They had come out of their imaginations. And though they then believed that they were at the mercy of these things, they had created them. We are now going to be at the mercy of things that we created, but which no longer are subject to our imaginations. That we've lost imaginative control of the universe. I think that's what he thinks has happened. Or we're about to.
But, again, in terms of patterns repeating themselves, maybe humans will live with AI and will perceive them in the same way like earlier humans perceived these, I don't know, the planets and astrology, and maybe they will make news stories about them and worship these AI beings. And so, who knows what people will come up with. It's hard to imagine the complete end of human imagination. I suppose, just as everything ends, one day humanity will end too. I'm not so sure it will be with AI yet, but it does. I mean, the technology does give, one pause, also augmented humans, its combination with excessive wealth concentration, the hierarchy, social hierarchies this is going to create, all of that is going to change our relationship to, I think, history, because it's going to change our notions of agency, but not yet.
And finally, do you think it makes sense to talk about history and the history of things that aren't part of the human story? So the history of the planet, say. So at some point, human beings will end. But there is a story of the planet There is a story of the environment in which we live that predates us and will. There are interesting, terrifying books. There was a vogue for them a few years ago, imagining a post-human future, not because we've merged with machines, but because we've gone the way of the dinosaurs. And what will be the story of the planet after we've gone? Does the word history apply to that? Are you happy talking about history in that sense? Or, I think I instinctively do think of history as a human activity. Do animals have histories? I'm not sure. They have stories, and there are stories that you can tell about them, and they have pasts and all of that. But history, without going all the way to Fukuyama and thinking of history as a 300-year story of human problem solving and the problem is solved, I do find it hard to think of history without human beings at the center of it.
Yeah, I suppose I do too. But even more so, the history needs to have an audience or somebody who's who's processing it. If you don't have somebody listening to history or like making sense of it, then that's how you need humans or some kind of agents, I think.
And the event, the truly apocalyptic event, because there's also a vogue for thinking about that too. That academic field called existential risk, which sort of spends its time thinking about not the events that might wipe out 99% of the human race, but the events that might wipe out 100%, and claiming, as some of them do, that the big difference is between 99% and 100% rather than between all of us still being around and 99% of us being gone. But history certainly survives catastrophe, because unless you get the kind of catastrophe that is a total eradication, which does seem on almost all levels very implausible, it's very hard to imagine the scenario which is, at some point there will be an end of the human race, but the immediate scenario, which is the end of human agency, whatever Harari might think, it's very hard to imagine that in any foreseeable future. History is still consistent with catastrophe. So that earlier millenarian view that the end of history is the event that is the ultimate transformative event, we don't seem to have that in the 21st century, in that we can imagine these terrible events, but human agency is still absolutely at the center of the story before, during, and after. The kinds of events that we think of tend to be the events where human beings are implicated all the way through. That, to me, still is history. I don't think of history ending because some event is going to bring it to an end. We're not in the 17th or 16th century in that sense, I don't think.
No, we still have much more agency and reflexivity and ability to do, big picture thinking and understand the causes of problems and so on. But it is possible to imagine a period of disorder or fragmentation where we lose some of this knowledge, and then history restarts in the sense of the agency and the knowledge has to be recovered. So we're not there, but I think we should consider these scenarios as opposed to thinking that history has ended, which I don't think anybody agrees with anymore, or that some kind of order or historical pace towards progress is going to be restored very quickly, which I think many more people do.
Still believe, you think? You think that's the illusion of our age, not the end of history, but the history is going to restart in a way that we feel comfortable with?
Which may not be the case.
We have got a new bonus episode coming out on Saturday to accompany this series on the history of bad ideas. And I'm going to be talking to the historian Lucia Rubinelli about another idea with a long and complicated and often bad history. We're discussing sovereignty, what it means, and what's wrong with it. To get that episode, you just need to sign up to PPF Plus, and you will get all of our bonus episodes for this, our past series, all our future series. It's just £5 a month or £50 for the year. You can click on the link in our show description or go to our website, ppfideas.com, where you can find out everything you need to know about this podcast. On Sunday, the episode in our regular slot in this history of bad ideas is a conversation with the astrophysicist Chris Lintott about the steady-state theory of the universe. What went wrong with that? This has been Past, Present, Future, brought to you in partnership with the London Review of Books. Past, Present, Future is part of the Airwave podcast network.